Thrice-Greatest Hermes, Volume 1. By George Robert Stowe Mead. Chapter 1. The Remains of the Trismegistic Literature. Writer and Reader. Little did I anticipate when, years ago, I commenced the translation of several Trismegistic tractates, that the endeavor would ultimately expand into these comprehensive volumes. My exclusive objective at that juncture was to render the more significant of these magnificent theosophical treatises into an English idiom that might, perhaps, be deemed in some modest measure worthy of their Greek originals. I was then more profoundly captivated by the sermons themselves than by the manifold problems to which they gave rise, finding greater delight in the spiritual atmosphere they engendered than in the critical considerations which insistently imposed themselves upon my intellect, as I strove to comprehend their significance regarding the historical development of religious concepts within the Western world. And now, furthermore, when I take pen in hand to grapple with the complexities of drafting an introduction for those who will be gracious enough to follow my entirely inadequate labors, it is to the tractates themselves that I return recurrently for revitalization in this undertaking, and every time I consult them, I am convinced that the finest among them are deserving of all the toil a scholar can bestow upon them. Although it remains true that the structural composition of these volumes, with their prolegomena and commentaries and voluminous annotations, resembles that of a technical treatise, it has nevertheless been my objective to render them entirely accessible to the lay reader, even to the monolingual individual who, though not a scholar himself, may yet possess a profound interest in such esoteric studies. These volumes must, consequently, naturally fall short of the rigorous precision enjoyed by the publications of technical specialists, which are replete with direct quotations from a multitude of ancient and modern tongues, possessing, on the other hand, the distinct advantage of appealing to a broader audience, while simultaneously providing the specialist with every necessary indication for verifying the assertions and translations. Nor should the general reader be intimidated by an introductory tome bearing the imposing subtitle of Prolegomena, presuming that these chapters are inevitably of a tedious, critical character, for the subjects addressed are of immense intrinsic fascination, and remain supplementary to the Trismegistic sermons, frequently contributing material of a similar disposition to that found within our tractates. Certain portions of these prolegomena have evolved from the commentaries, for I discovered that subjects occasionally lent themselves to such extensive digressions that they could be relocated to the prolegomena to the considerable benefit of the commentary. The arrangement of the material thus accumulated, however, has proven an exceedingly arduous endeavor, and I have been capable of preserving but minimal logical sequence within the chapters, though this is attributable predominantly to the circumstance that the extant Trismegistic literature itself is preserved for us in a profoundly chaotic fashion, and I presently perceive no method of imposing any definitive order upon this chaos. The extant Trismegistic literature. To distinguish our texts both from the Egyptian books of Thoth and the Hermes prayers of the popular Egyptian cult, as discovered within the Greek magical papyri, and equally from the subsequent Hermetic alchemical literature, I have adopted the terminology of Trismegistic literature in lieu of the customary designation of Hermetic. Of this Greek Trismegistic literature proper, a substantial portion is lost, leaving that which remains to us, of which I have endeavored to assemble every fragment and vestige, to fall under 5 principal headings: the Corpus Hermeticum, the Perfect Sermon or the Asclepius, excerpts by Stobaeus, references and fragments in the writings of the Fathers, references and fragments in the works of the philosophers. The Corpus Hermeticum encompasses what had, prior to Reitzenstein, been recognized as the Poimandra's collection of 14 sermons and the definitions of Asclepius. The Perfect Sermon, or the Asclepius, is no longer extant in the original Greek, but survives solely within an Old Latin translation. There are 27 excerpts, derived from otherwise lost sermons, by John Stobaeus, a pagan scholar from the late 5th or early 6th century, who was a voracious reader and compiled a supremely valuable anthology of extractions from Greek authors, though studiously evading every Christian writer. Certain of these excerpts are of considerable length, most notably those originating from the sermon entitled The Virgin of the World, with these 27 excerpts remaining entirely exclusive of extracts from sermons still preserved within our corpus. From the Church Fathers we acquire numerous references and 25 brief fragments, otherwise entirely unknown to us, and considerably broadening our comprehension regarding the scope of this literature. From Zosimus and Fulgentius we derive 3 fragments, and from the former and Iamblichus, alongside Julian the emperor-philosopher, we secure a multitude of invaluable references. Such constitute what at first sight might appear to be the comparatively sparse remnants of what was once an exceedingly prolific literature. Yet when we consider that this literature was predominantly restricted and maintained in secrecy, we cannot but congratulate ourselves that such an abundance has been preserved, recognizing indeed, as we shall observe subsequently, that save for the fortuitous circumstance of a Hermetic apologist selecting certain sermons to exemplify the loyal disposition of Trismegistic doctrine concerning kings and sovereigns, we should be deprived of any Hermetic corpus whatsoever, and remain reliant solely upon our extracts and fragments. Yet even with our Hermetic corpus before us we must never forget that we possess merely a fraction of the Trismegistic literature, the flotsam and jetsam, so to speak, of a once magnificent vessel that navigated the oceans of human endeavor, and served as an ark of refuge for many a pious and cultivated soul. Allusions to the lost writings of the school will confront us abundantly throughout the course of our scholarly investigations, and a deliberate attempt will be made later on to construct a conceptual framework regarding the principal typologies of this literature. Consideration is warranted for the remainder of the so-called Hermetic works, medico-mathematical, astrological and medico-astrological and alchemical, and for a comprehensive index of the manifold inventions attributed to the Thrice-Greatest, representing inventions as numerous as, and almost identical with, those ascribed to Orpheus by an affectionate posterity along the trajectory of pure Hellenic tradition. I would direct the student to the Greek library of Jonas Albertus Fabricius. Regarding the alchemical and medieval literature, the 2 magnificent treatises by Berthelot are indispensable, namely, Collection of the Ancient Greek Alchemists, and Chemistry in the Middle Ages. In close connection with the development of this form of Hermetic tradition must be considered the Hermes writings and traditions among the Arabs. Consult Bozaber's Critical History of Manichaeus and of Manichaeism. Additionally, Fleischer, Hermes Trismegistus to the Human Soul, Arabic and German, Bardenhewer, Book of Hermes Trismegistus, which among the Arabs is said to be on the chastisement of the soul, and especially R. Piechman, the pupil of George Ebers, who devotes the 4th part of his treatise, entitled Hermes Trismegistus according to Egyptian and Oriental traditions, to an examination of the Hermes tradition among Syrians and Arabs. Reitzenstein treats very briefly upon the development of this subsequent Hermetic literature on pages 188 to 200 of his Poimandres. The original manuscript of our corpus. From the fragmentary nature of the remains of the Trismegistic literature that have descended to us, it will be immediately apparent that establishing a critical text thereof is a formidable undertaking, for, apart from the corpus, the texts must be compiled from the works of numerous authors. This, however, has never yet been accomplished in any genuinely critical fashion, so that a translator is primarily obliged to secure the finest existing critical texts of these authors from which to construct his version. This, I hope, I have succeeded in accomplishing. Nevertheless, numerous obscurities persist within the texts of the excerpts, fragments, and quotations. It remains highly desirable that a scholar uniquely acquainted with this literature should assemble these materials into a single volume, refining the labors of specialists on the texts of Stobaeus and the Church Fathers through the application of his own specialized erudition. Even the text of our corpus still lacks a comprehensively critical edition. Although Reitzenstein has executed this task most admirably for the Corpus Hermeticum, basing his work upon 5 manuscripts and the printed texts of earlier editions, he has not deemed it appropriate to provide a complete text. A catalogue of the manuscripts known at that time is provided in Harles's edition of Fabricius's Bibliotheca Graeca, whereas Parthe supplies notes concerning the only 2 manuscripts he utilized in his edition of 14 sermons from our corpus. It is generally believed, however, that additional manuscripts may remain concealed within continental libraries. All prior scholarship concerning these manuscripts, however, is entirely superseded by Reitzenstein in his illuminating history of the text, wherein the entire matter is expounded with the exhaustive thoroughness that characterizes the finest German scholarship. From him, we learn that the preservation of our Hermetic corpus is owed to a single manuscript discovered during the 11th century in a deplorable condition. Entire quires and individual leaves were missing from both the beginning and the end. Furthermore, even within the surviving pages, particularly in the final third, the script had become illegible in numerous places. In this compromised state, the manuscript came into the possession of Michael Psellus, the eminent reviver of Platonic studies at Byzantium, presumably during a period when his theological orthodoxy was being called into question. Psellus resolved to return these writings to circulation, whilst simultaneously guarding himself against any suspicion that their contents mirrored his own philosophical conclusions. This accounts for the peculiar scolion attached to the Corpus Hermeticum, which initially appears to be a mere monastic denunciation of the Pomandras as the devil in disguise, seeking to lead men astray from the truth. Nevertheless, its conclusion betrays such a profound interest in the material that his engagement must have extended far beyond the purely philological. That such an interest was kindled in the subsequent centuries at Byzantium may be inferred from the fact that the final 3 chapters, which directly justify polytheism, or rather paganism, were deliberately omitted from a portion of the manuscripts. Consequently, only that segment of the corpus which corresponded to what might initially be perceived as a Neoplatonism assimilated to Christianity received wider circulation. The text was reproduced with a mechanical exactitude. Thus, although its textual tradition is extraordinarily corrupted, it remains uniform, allowing us to recover Psellus's copy with absolute certainty from the manuscripts of the 14th century. These Trismegistic sermons attained a broader sphere of influence with the burgeoning of humanism in the West. During the latter part of the 14th and the dawn of the 15th century, Georgius Gemistus Pletho introduced Neoplatonism from Byzantium into Italy as a veritable religion, leaving a profound impression upon Cosimo de' Medici. Marsilio Ficino, whom Cosimo had early on selected to head the future academy, must have undertaken his Latin translation of our corpus, which appeared in 1463, to serve as the foundational text for this grand intellectual enterprise. Cosimo had commissioned a monk, Fra Leonardo of Pistoia, to bring the Greek text from Bulgaria, and it currently remains preserved within the Medicean library. It was not until the middle of the 16th century, however, that the Greek text was finally printed. In the interim, spurred by the profound interest the humanists took in these writings, A proliferation of manuscripts emerged that sought to render the text more comprehensible or stylistically elegant. Such manuscripts are of absolutely no critical value to the textual tradition. Texts and translations. We shall now proceed to provide an account of the texts and translations of the Trismegistic writings, a bibliographical endeavor that the general reader will likely bypass, yet one the dedicated student will undoubtedly appreciate at its true value. The most definitive account of the texts and translations up to the year 1790 is that of Hermes, who comprehensively rewrote the earlier account compiled by Fabricius. The Editio Princeps was not a Greek text, but rather a Latin translation by Marsilio Ficino, published in quarto format in 1471. Although both the publisher's name and the place of publication are absent from the volume, the British Museum Catalogue inserts them parenthetically as Gerardus de Lissa, Treviso, presumably relying upon the authority of Hermes. This translation comprised the so-called Pomandres, divided into 14 chapters, or rather, 14 distinct treatises, under the overarching title, The Book of Mercurius Trismegistus on the Power and Wisdom of God. The immense popularity of this work is evidenced by the multitude of editions through which it subsequently passed. No fewer than 22 editions have appeared, the first 8 of which were published within the brief span of a quarter of a century. In 1548, an Italian translation of Ficino's Latin version of the Pomandres collection appeared, entitled The Pomander of Mercury Trismegistus, rendered into the Florentine dialect by Tommaso Benci and printed in Florence in 12. A second edition was printed in Florence in 1549 in octavo, featuring numerous emendations by Paitoni. The first Greek text was printed in Paris in 1554 by Adrianus Turnebus. It included the Pomandres and the definitions of Asclepius, to which Ficino's Latin version was appended. The title reads The Pomander of Mercury Trismegistus, or On Divine Power and Wisdom. Aesculapius definitions to King Ammon. The Greek text was edited by P. Angelo de Barga. In 1557, the first French translation by Gabriel Duprot appeared in Paris, bearing the lengthy title 2 Books of Mercury Trismegistus Hermes, very ancient theologian and excellent philosopher. One of the power and wisdom of God, the other of the will of God, with a dialogue of Louis Lazarel, Christian poet, entitled The Basin of Hermes. This appears to be merely a translation of an edition of Ficino's Latin version published in Paris by Henricus Stephanus in 1505, to which a certain dignitary, Lois Lazarel, who further rejoiced in the agnomen of Septempedinus, appended a lucubration of his own of absolutely no value, for the title of Estienne's edition runs, Pomander, Mercury's Book on the Wisdom and Power of God. Asclepius, the same Mercury's Book on the Divine Will. Also, The Basin of Hermes by Lazarus Septempedinus. In 1574, Franciscus Flus's Candale reprinted the Greek text of Turnebus in quarto at Bordeaux, having amended it with the assistance of the younger Scaliger and other humanists, and pairing it with a Latin translation under the title The Pomander or Pomander of Mercury Trismegistus. This edition remains of critical utility to this day. He subsequently produced a French translation, printed in 1579, also in folio at Bordeaux, bearing the title The Pomander of Mercury Trismegistus of Christian Philosophy, Knowledge of the Divine Word, and of the Excellence of the Works of God. We are assured that this work is translated from the Greek copy, complete with a collation of extensive commentaries. This is followed by the full name and titles of Flusses, namely François Monsieur de Foix of the Candale family, Captal de Books, etc., Bishop of Aire, etc., with the entire volume dedicated to Marguerite of France, Queen of Navarre. 12 years later, Franciscus Patricius printed an edition comprising the text of the sermons of the Corpus, the Asclepius, and the majority of the excerpts alongside certain fragments. He had, however, arranged all these materials in a decidedly arbitrary fashion, and just as arbitrarily altered the text, which otherwise generally followed that of Turnebus and Candale, in innumerable places. To this, he appended a Latin translation, wherein he amended the earlier versions of Ficino and de Foy in no fewer than 1,040 instances, or so he informs us. These emendations were subsequently incorporated into his new philosophy of the universe, printed at Ferrara in folio 1591, and again at Venice by R. Maetis in 1593 as an appendix to his new Phil of the University, which had by then increased to 50 books. This Latin translation by Patrizzi was printed separately, together with the Chaldean oracles, at Hamburg in 12º, also in 1593 under the title Philosophical Magic. The latter edition bears the subscription on the title page, already now for the first time from the Ransovian Library and the Darkness, which Harles explains as a reprint by Plain Henner. Ranzu, who is, however, described in the volume itself as Produx. It appears to have been reprinted once more at Hamburg in 1594 in octavo. Meantime, the Carmelite friar, Hannibal Roscelus, had been laboriously engaged for many years upon an edition of the Pomandras with most elaborate commentaries. This work was printed at Krakow by Lazarus in 6 volumes in folio from 1585 to 1590. Roscelus treats of philosophy, theology, the Pope, the Scriptures, and all disciplines in these monstrous comments, inept as some say, while others bestow upon him great praise. His title is Pomander Mercury Trismegistus. This was reprinted with the text and translation of de Foy in folio at Cologne in 1630, under the title The Divine Pomander Hermetius Mercury Trismegistus. Hitherto nothing had been achieved in England, but in 1611 an edition of Ficino's translation was printed in London. This was followed by what purports to be a translation of the Pomandras from Arabic, by that learned divine, Dr. Everard, as the title page sets forth. It was printed in London in 1650 in octavo, with a preface by J.F., and bears the title The Divine Pomander of Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus. Translated formerly out of the Arabic into Greek and thence into Latin and Dutch, and now out of the original into English. There was a second edition of Everard's version printed at London in 1657, in 12º. There are also reprints of the 1650 edition by Friar of Bath, with an introduction by Hargrave Jennings in 1884, by P.B. Randolph, Toledo, Ohio, 1889, and by the Theosophical Publishing Society in the Collectanea Hermetica, edited by W. Wynne Westcott in 1893. To what Dutch translation Everard refers I cannot discover, for the only one known to me is that printed at Amsterdam in 1652 in 12º. It is a translation of Patrizzi's text, and bears the title 16 Books of Hermes Trismegistus, translated from the Greek, with one translated from the Latin by F. Patricius, in which he proves that these philosophy had flourished before Moses, etc. Harles says nothing of this edition, but speaks of one printed at Amsterdam in 1643 in quarto, by Nicholas van Rauwenstein, but I can find no other trace of it. The first German translation was executed by a certain Alathopoulos, and was printed at Hamburg in 1706 under the title Hermes Trismegistus Knowledge of Nature, etc., containing 17 pieces. This was reprinted at Stuttgart in 1855, in a curious collection by J. Schiebel entitled Smaller Wonder Stage. The first German translation was executed by a certain Alathopoulos, and was printed at Hamburg in 1706 under the title Hermes Trismegistus Knowledge of Nature, etc., containing 17 pieces. This was reprinted at Stuttgart in 1855, in a curious collection by J. Schiebel entitled Small Wonder Stage. The title reads Hermes Trismegistus Introduction to the Highest Knowledge of the Understanding of Nature and the Caves Not Placed Therein, with an appendix concerning the person of Hermes, etc. But why Schiebel should have reprinted Alathopoulos' translation is not entirely clear, when in 1781 a new translation into German, with critical notes and valuable suggestions for amending the text, had appeared by Dietrich Tiedemann, entitled Hermes Trismegistus Poemandres, or On the Divine Power and Wisdom, a rare book which, already in 1827, Baumgarten Crusius laments as almost unfindable in the Republic of Letters, and of which the British Museum possesses no copy. It is remarkable that of a work which exhausted so many editions in translation and was evidently received with such great enthusiasm, there have been so few editions of the text, and that for 2 centuries and a quarter no attempt was made to collate the different manuscripts and editions, until in 1854 Gustav Parthe printed a critical text of the 14 pieces of Poemandres, at Berlin, under the title Hermes Trismegistus Poemandres, to which he appended a Latin translation based on the original version of Ficino successively revised by de Foy and Patrizzi. Parthe's promise to edit the remaining writings of Hermes has not been fulfilled, and no one else has so far attempted this most necessary task. Reitzenstein's opinion of Parthe's text, however, is exceptionally unfavorable. In the first place, Parthe accepted Patrizzi's arbitrary alterations as a true tradition of the text. In the second, he himself saw neither of the manuscripts on which he says he relies. The first of these was very carelessly copied for him and carelessly utilized by him, while the second, which was transcribed by D. Ham, is severely corrupt owing to highly numerous corrections and interpolations by a later hand, all of which Parthe has adopted as ancient readings. His text, therefore, concludes Reitzenstein, is doubly falsified, a profoundly discouraging judgment for lovers of accuracy. In 1866 there appeared at Paris, in octavo, a complete translation into French of the Trismegistic treatises and fragments by Louis Menard, entitled Hermes Trismegistus, preceded by an interesting study on the origin of the Hermetic books, of which a second edition was printed in 1867. This is beyond question the most sympathetic version that we at present possess. Everard's version of the Poemandres being reprinted in 1884 by Friar of Bath, the rest of the treatises were retranslated by Anna Kingsford and Edward Maitland from Menard's French version, and appeared in 1885, published by Friar, but bearing a publisher's name in India, under the general title The Hermetic Works. The Virgin of the World of Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus. Meantime, in 1882, J. D. Chambers had published a crabbed and slavishly literal translation of the Poemandres, together with the excerpts from Stobaeus and the notices of Hermes in the Fathers, with an introductory preface under the title The Theological and Philosophical Works of Hermes Trismegistus, Christian Neoplatonist. Indeed, the loose and erroneous version of Everard is far more comprehensible than this fantastically literal translation. For the past 6 years I have myself been publishing, in the pages of the Theosophical Review, translations of the Trismegistic sermons, and also a few of the studies now included in these prolegomena. All of the former, however, have been now carefully revised, and the latter have for the most part been greatly enlarged and improved. Finally, in 1904, E. Reitzenstein of Strasbourg published at Leipzig his illuminating study, Poemandres, in which he provides the critical text of the Corpus Hermeticum, based upon 5 manuscripts and the best early printed editions, with all that minute care, knowledge of paleography, and enthusiasm for philology which characterizes the paramount textual critical work of modern scholarship. Why, however, Reitzenstein has not performed the same good service for the whole of the corpus as he has done for the selected sermons, remains a mystery. He is the very man for the task, and the service he could render would be highly appreciated by many. So much, then, for the existing partial texts and translations of the extant Trismegistic literature. Of the translations with which I am acquainted, Everard's, the favorite in England, because of its dignified English, is fraught with errors, mistranslations, and obscurities. It is hopeless to try to understand Hermes from this version. Chambers's translation is so slavishly literal that it ceases to be English in many places, in others goes wide of the sense, and, in general, is entirely exasperating. Menard's French translation is elegant and sympathetic, yet it remains exceedingly liberal in numerous instances, in fact, not infrequently becoming entirely emancipated from the original text. The most strictly accurate rendition is Parthy's Latin version, but even within such a literal translation he occasionally falters, while in general no one can fully comprehend the Latin without recourse to the Greek. To adequately translate Hermes demands not merely a profound command of Greek, but also an intimate understanding of that gnosis which he has not infrequently so admirably transmitted to us. Chapter 2. The History of the Evolution of Opinion. The Chief Points of Interrogation. We must now consider the following points of profound interest. The early Church Fathers generally accepted the Trismegistic writings as exceedingly ancient and authoritative, and in their apologetic treatises they cite them to bolster the foundational tenets of Christianity. During the revival of learning, for more than a century and a half, the humanists universally embraced these works as an invaluable adjunct to the Christian faith, and as being entirely harmonious with its doctrines, to such an extent that they campaigned to substitute Trismegistus for Aristotle within the academies. Over the subsequent 2.5 centuries, however, a consensus gradually emerged, infinitesimal in its inception but ultimately eclipsing nearly every other perspective, asserting that these writings were Neoplatonic forgeries and blatant plagiarisms of Christian doctrine. Finally, with the dawn of the 20th century, the subject was emancipated from the realm of mere conjecture, and it began to be anchored upon the solid foundation of historical and critical research, unveiling inquiries of the utmost importance regarding the history of Christian origins and their relationship to Hellenistic theology and theosophy, and casting a brilliant illumination upon the development of Gnosticism. The first point shall be expounded in detail within the volume, providing a translation of all passages and references concerning Thrice-Greatest Hermes found in the writings of the Church Fathers, while the latter point will become abundantly evident, we trust, throughout the general course of our studies. The second and third points now demand our immediate attention, particularly the third, for we have painstakingly endeavored to familiarize ourselves with every argument that has contributed to the formation of this hypothesis, and unless we are compelled to radically alter our entire understanding of the chronology of so-called Neoplatonism, we remain thoroughly unconvinced, finding that this hypothesis has grown from unfounded assertions, and that not a single work exists which attempts to argue the matter in a satisfactory manner, nor are there any claims presented that could not just as easily demonstrate the priority of the Trismegistic school over the Neoplatonic as the reverse. We shall therefore proceed to offer an account of this chaos of contradictory opinions, extracting the most salient points for examination. The opinions of the humanists. That the pioneering scholars of the revival of learning were unanimously delighted by the Trismegistic writings, is evident from the bibliography previously provided, and that they would follow the judgment of the ancient fathers in this regard is only natural to expect. For to these scholars not only did the texts predate Christianity, but they also held an unwavering conviction that Hermes was a historically existent figure, akin to biblical patriarchs, such as Enoch and Noah, and furthermore, that he lived prior to or contemporaneously with Moses. Thus, in the Editio Princeps of Ficino we read, "Whoever thou art who readest these words, whether grammarian or rhetorician or philosopher or theologian, know thou that I am Hermes the Thrice-Greatest, at whom the Egyptians and other nations first marveled, and subsequently the ancient Christian theologians, standing in utter stupefaction at my rare doctrine of things divine." The opinion of Ficino, that the author of the Pomandra's tractates possessed knowledge of both Egyptian and Greek, is of particular interest as representing a scholar uncontaminated by the infinite doubts with which the atmosphere of modern criticism is permeated, and thus capable of establishing a pure connection with his subject. Sharing this conviction were Lois Lazarel and Duprot, the first French translator, while the Italian Cardinal Patrizzi appends to his labors the following exquisite words, which he places in the mouth of Hermes. "Until now, my son, I, banished from my home, have dwelled as an expatriate in exile. Now safe and sound I seek my home once more. And when but yet a little while I shall have departed from thee, freed from these corporal bonds, see that thou dost not mourn me as one dead. For I return to that supreme and joyous condition to which the citizens of the universe shall ascend when in the afterstate. For there the only God is supreme Lord, and he shall fill his citizens with wondrous joy, compared to which the condition down here which is regarded by the multitude as life, ought rather to be termed death." Patrizzi believed that Hermes was contemporary with Moses, basing his views upon the opinion of Eusebius in his Chronicum, and he maintained that it would be to the profound advantage of the Christian world if the admirable and pious philosophy contained within the Trismegistic writings were substituted in the public academies for Aristotle, whom he regarded as overflowing with impiety. The first doubt, and that such views remained entirely undisputed as late as 1630, is evidenced by the continued favor bestowed upon the voluminous commentaries of de Foy and Rossel. Nevertheless, some 50 years previously, a resolute pioneer of skepticism had vigorously assailed the validity of the then universal Hermes tradition on at least one point, and that a truly fundamental one. For Patrizzi declares that a certain Joe Goropius Becanus was the first after so many centuries to dare to assert that Hermes never existed. Yet the worthy Goropius, who appears to have flourished around 1580, judging by an antiquarian treatise he authored concerning the race and language of the Cimbri or Germani published in Amsterdam, had not yet gathered any followers in a belief that is now universally accepted by modern critical scholarship. Yet this pertains to the Hermes saga and not directly to the question of the Trismegistic works, and therefore we may omit for the present any reference to the host of contradictory opinions concerning Hermes which are found in all the writers to whom we are referring, and none of which, prior to the decipherment of the hieroglyphics, possess any particular value. The launching of the theory of plagiarism. It was around the middle of the 17th century that the theory of plagiarism and forgery was initially introduced. Ursin, a pastor of the Evangelical Church at Ratisbon, published at Nuremberg in 1661, a work in the second part of which he examined Hermes Trismegistus and his writings, and endeavored to demonstrate that they were wholesale plagiarisms of Christianity, but his arguments were subjected to severe criticism by Brucker a century later. This extreme perspective of Ursin was subsequently moderated into the subsidiary theories that the Trismegistic works were either composed by a semi-Christian author or interpolated through later Christian revisions. The most distinguished figure among the early adherents of the former opinion is that of Isaac Casaubon, who dates these writings to the beginning of the 2nd century, while Casaubon's assertions, however, were promptly refuted by Cudworth in his celebrated work The True Intellectual System of the Universe, the first edition of which was printed at London in folio 1678. Cudworth would have it, however, that Casaubon was correct as far as the treatises entitled The Shepherd of Men and The Secret Sermon on the Mountain are concerned, and that these treatises were counterfeited by Christians subsequent to the time of Iamblichus, a profoundly curious position to assume, since a number of the treatises themselves look back to this very shepherd as the foundational document of the entire Pomandrous cycle. But, indeed, thus far we possess no substantive arguments, nor any genuinely critical investigation, so that we need not detain the reader amongst these warring opinions, upon which the capstone was set by the violent outburst of Kahlberg in defense of orthodoxy against the alchemists, Rosicrucians, Quakers, Anabaptists, Quietists, etc., of which fanatici, as he designates them, Hermes, he declares, was the patriarch. The only argument adduced. One might almost believe that Kahlberg was an incarnation of a church father continuing his ancient polemic against heresy, for in any case the whole question of heresy was now revived, and the 18th and 19th century criticism of the Trismegistic works almost invariably commences with this prejudice in mind and seeks to attribute the Trismegistic writings to Neoplatonism, which it regards as the most formidable opponent of orthodoxy from the 3rd century onward. Harles provides the references to all the primary factors in the evolution of this opinion during the 18th century, but the sole argument that the century produced, indeed the only argument that has ever been adduced, is that the doctrines of the Trismegistic writings are unequivocally Platonic, and that two of that type of mystical Platonism which was specifically the characteristic of the teachings of Iamblichus at the close of the 3rd century AD, and which is generally termed Neoplatonism, and therefore, these writings were forged by the Neoplatonists to sustain a dying paganism against the ever more and more vigorous Christianity. We concede the premises, but we categorically reject the conclusion. But before elucidating the weakness of this conclusion drawn by apologetic scholarship, we must address the literature on the subject from the preceding century. The 18th century yielded no arguments in support of this conclusion beyond the principal premises which we have conceded. Has the 19th century produced any others so as to justify the position adopted by the echoes of opinion in all the popular encyclopedias with regard to these immensely valuable and beautiful treatises? If our encyclopedias deign to base their assertions upon authority, they direct us to Fabricius and Baumgarten Crusius. We have already observed that Harles will not help us much, so will the latter authority illuminate the subject any further? We are afraid not, for, instead of a substantial volume, we have before us a slender academic exercise of only 19 pages, in which the author advances the unsubstantiated opinion that these books were fabricated by Porphyry and his school, and this mainly because he believes that Aureli had demonstrated the previous year that the cosmogony of Sanchoniathon was an invention of the Platonici. Moreover, was not Porphyry an enemy of Christ? For did he not write 15 books against the Christians? All of which can scarcely be dignified with the designation of an argument, much less with that of a proof. The theory of Hilgers. The same may be observed of the brief academic thesis of Hilgers, who initially demonstrates the frailty of Möller's peculiar opinion that the author was a Christian who masqueraded as a pagan and deliberately inserted errors. Hilgers finally concludes with the feeble deduction that Christian doctrine was known to the author of the Poemandres cycle, especially the Gospel of John and the Epistles of Paul, but how it is possible to conjecture anything beyond this, he does not know. Of the possibility regarding the priority of the Poemandres to the writings of John and Paul, Hilgers does not seem to dream, though nevertheless this is as logical a deduction as the one he derives from the points of contact between the two groups of literature. But Hilgers possesses an ulterior motive of his own, and a very blunt one at that, as he posits that the Shepherd of Men was written contemporaneously with the Shepherd of Hermes, that rudimentary product of what is termed the subapostolic age, a document held in profound esteem by the early outer communities of general Christianity, and utilized for purposes of edification. Our Shepherd, Hilgers maintains, was composed in opposition to the Hermes document, but he can do nothing but point to the similarity of name as a proof of his hypothesis. This inverted opinion we shall endeavor to reverse in a subsequent chapter concerning Hermes and Hermes. As to the author of Our Shepherd, Hilgers believes he has demonstrated that the writer was not a follower of the doctrines of the Christ, but rather of the so-called Neoplatonists, and among these especially of Philo-Judaeus, for in fact he seems, says Hilgers, to have been a therapeut. The German theory of Neoplatonic syncretism. Here we witness the first emergence of another tendency, for the more attention is bestowed upon the Trismegistic writings, the more it is apparent that they cannot be ascribed to Neoplatonism, provided that, as is generally maintained, Neoplatonism begins with Ammonius Saccas, Plotinus, and Porphyry in the 3rd century. Therefore, within this subject, and within this subject alone, we observe a propensity among later authors to antedate the Neoplatonists so as to encompass Philo-Judaeus, who flourished during the first half of the 1st century. Following these lines, we should soon trace Neoplatonism back to Plato and Pythagoras, and thus be forced to discard the Neo and revert to the ancient, esteemed appellation of simple Platonicity. But already by this period in Germany the theory of a Neoplatonic syncretism serving to sustain a declining heathendom against an ascendant Christianity had become crystallized, as may be observed from the article on Hermes, Hermetic writings in Pauli's renowned Encyclopedia of Classical Antiquity, where this position is presumed from the very outset. Parthe, however, in 1854, in his preface, ventures upon no such opinion, but articulates a belief that we might yet discover in Egypt a demotic text of the Poemandres, which indicates that he considered the original to have been composed in Egyptian, and therefore not by a Neoplatonist. The French theory of Egyptian origin. In France, moreover, the Egyptian paternity of the Trismegistic writings, and that too along eminently rational lines, was asserted around the same time, namely in 1858, by Artaud in his article on Hermes Trismegistus in Heffer's New General Biography, published in Paris by Messrs. Firmin Didat. Artaud writes, "In the mystic sense Thoth or the Egyptian Hermes served as the symbol of the divine mind, as he was the incarnated thought, the living word, the primitive prototype of the logos of Plato and the word of the Christians, and we have heard Champollion, the younger, giving expression to the formal opinion that the books of Hermes Trismegistus genuinely contained the ancient Egyptian doctrine of which traces can be discovered from the hieroglyphics which adorn the monuments of Egypt. Moreover, if these fragments themselves are subjected to examination, we discover within them a theology sufficiently in accord with the doctrines set forth by Plato in his Timaeus, doctrines which remain entirely distinct from those of the other schools of Greece, and which were therefore believed to have been derived by Plato from the temples of Egypt, when he journeyed thither to hold converse with its priests. Artaud is additionally of the opinion that these Trismegistic treatises constitute translations from the Egyptian. The views of Menard. In the present day, bolstered by our advanced comprehension of Egyptology, This hypothesis must be articulated in far more meticulous terms before it can attain acceptance among the learned. But nevertheless it was evidently the conviction of Deveria, who in a work of which he only succeeded in drafting the first 2 pages, proposed to provide commentary upon the entirety of the Trismegistic books from the perspective of an Egyptologist. For these books, he declared, afforded an almost comprehensive exposition of the esoteric philosophy of ancient Egypt. But by far the most sympathetic and genuinely intelligent account of the subject is that provided by Menard, who affords us a welcome respite from the prevailing chorus of the German theory of Neoplatonic syncretism. And although we by no means concur with the entirety of his propositions, it is a profound relief to introduce a breath of fresh air into the general stagnation of our present survey of opinions. The fragments of Trismegistic literature that have descended to us constitute the sole surviving vestiges of that Egyptian philosophy which emerged from the synthesis of the religious doctrines of Egypt with the philosophical tenets of Greece. In other terms, what the works of Philo represented for the sacred literature of the Jews, the Hermaica represented for the Egyptian sacred writings. Legend and myth were allegorized and philosophized, being subsequently supplanted by vision and instruction. But who were the authors of this theosophic method? This inquiry is of the utmost interest to us, for it serves as a pivotal factor in resolving the problem of the literary evolution of Christianity. Given that there are intimate conceptual correspondences between several of the Hermetic documents and specific Jewish and Christian writings, particularly the opening verses of Genesis, the treatises of Philo, the Fourth Gospel, and, beyond all, the writings of the eminent Gnostic doctors Basilides and Valentinus. Such and similar considerations lead Menard to examine the milieu of nascent Christianity and the various phenomena associated with its expansion, and this he undertakes from the perspective of an enlightened and independent historical scholar. Christianity, he observes, did not descend like a thunderbolt into the midst of a surprised and startled world. It underwent a period of incubation, and while it was engaged in developing the definitive form of its dogmas, the very problems for which it sought solutions were already subjects of profound contemplation in Greece, Asia, and Egypt. Analogous ideas permeated the intellectual atmosphere and crystallized into a diverse array of propositions. The multiplicity of sects that have emerged in our contemporary era under the banner of socialism can provide only a faint impression of the marvelous intellectual chemistry that had established its principal laboratory in Alexandria. Humanity had introduced into the arena mighty philosophical and moral problems. The origin of evil, the destiny of the soul, its fall and redemption, with the prize to be awarded being the governance of the conscience. The Christian solution triumphed and caused the remainder to fall into oblivion, submerged for the most part in the shipwreck of the past. Let us, therefore, upon encountering a fragment of this flotsam and jetsam, recognize within it the work of a defeated competitor and not of a plagiarist. Indeed, the triumph of Christianity was paved by those very individuals who considered themselves its rivals, but who were ultimately merely its forerunners. This designation suits them aptly, although many were contemporaries of the Christian era, while others emerged slightly later, for the succession of a religion commences only upon the day it is embraced by the nations, precisely as the reign of a claimant to the throne dates from the moment of his victory. Menard identifies 3 principal classifications within the Trismegistic treatises, which he attributes to Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian influences. Within these texts, he additionally perceives a nexus between Philo and the Gnostics. Between the earliest Gnostic sects and the Hellenic Jews represented by Philo, a vital link is missing, Yet this connection may be discerned in several of the Hermetic works, most notably the Shepherd of Men and the Sermon on the Mountain. In these treatises will also perhaps be found the rationale for the frequently noted discrepancies between the first three Gospels and the fourth. Subsequently, the direction in which this link ought to be sought is more clearly delineated, although in this instance Menard is, I believe, overly precise in his articulation. It appears certain that the shepherd originated from that school of Egyptian therapeuti, who have frequently and erroneously been conflated with the Essenes of Syria and Palestine. But instead of the physical discipline of the Essenes, who, according to Philo, engaged in manual labor, placed the fruits of their toil into a communal repository, and reduced philosophy to ethics, and ethics to charity, the monasteries of the therapeuti contributed to Christian proselytization a far more Hellenized demographic, one thoroughly trained in abstract speculations and mystical allegories. From these inclinations, coupled with the dogma of the Incarnation, the Gnostic sects emerged. The shepherd must presumably predate these schools. As for the Sermon on the Mountain, it may be situated, in order of ideas and date, between the shepherd and the earliest Gnostic schools, as it ought to marginally precede the founders of Gnosticism, Basilides, and Valentinus. If Gnosticism is understood, alongside Menard, to signify the Christianized theosophy of Basilides and Valentinus from the first quarter of the 2nd century onward, then the oldest Trismegistic treatises are demonstrably earlier, for their Gnosticism is manifestly of a far simpler form, in fact so much more rudimentary that, were we to proceed upon the crude hypothesis of a linear evolution, we should be compelled to accommodate intermediate forms of Gnosticism between them and the Basilidian and Valentinian Gnosis. And of this, Menard appears to be partially cognizant when writing. Within the Hermetic books, we may trace the trajectory of this Judeo-Egyptian gnosis, which, throughout the 1st century, coexisted alongside Christianity without permitting itself to be assimilated by it, passing imperceptibly from the Jewish school of Philo to the Greek school of Plotinus. Here, Menard employed the term Christianity to denote the movement that was subsequently designated as Catholic or General Christianity, the very institution to which these same Gnostics imparted the principal dogmas of its later theology. But if the Gnostics were therapeuti, and the Trismegistic authors were therapeuti, why should Menard categorize them as Jews, as he seemingly does in his intriguing query, where are the Jewish therapeuti at the close of the 2nd century? Undoubtedly, Philo labored to convey the impression that the therapeuti were predominantly Jewish, perhaps to garner respect for his compatriots in his apology for his nation. But the therapeuti were, evidently, by his own admission, drawn from all nations and dispersed abroad in remarkably numerous communities, although many Jews were assuredly among their ranks. Indeed, for Philo likely possessed scant knowledge regarding their communities beyond the Mareotic. If, therefore, the term therapeuti elucidates certain phenomena presented by these writings, the compound designation Jewish therapeuti most certainly fails to do so. Menard's own response to his query demonstrates that even these Mareotic therapeuti could not have been Orthodox Jews, for the French scholar proceeds to surmise not only that some, having converted to Christianity, became monks or Gnostics of the Basilidian or Valentinian schools, but that others increasingly assimilated themselves into paganism. And by paganism, our author clarifies that he does not mean polytheism, for at this period, everyone acknowledged a well-defined hierarchy within the divine order, presided over by a supreme god at the apex. Only for some this paramount deity was immanent in the world, while for others he existed beyond it. Menard's introduction meets with the general approbation of Reitzenstein, who characterizes it as astute, and concurs that he has accurately evaluated many of the factors, particularly from the theological side, Yet he, however, dissents and rightfully dissents from Menard regarding any direct Jewish influence upon the Trismegistic literature, and resolutely refuses to concede that the Pomandres can in any manner be classified as a Jewish Gnostic text. But the sensible perspectives of Menard proved impotent to arrest the crystallization of the German theory, which was virtually reiterated by Zeller, and once more by Piechman in his erudite essay, based. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.